Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Elliott Green. Hello, Elliott. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you, Lipton.
I'm great, Elliott. So we're going to hit the ground running by discussing some of your papers. So you wrote a paper some years ago titled "The Reversal of Fortune Thesis Reconsidered." And this paper is a critique of an earlier publication produced by Asimoglu and Robinson. And in the paper, you and your co-author contend that after the period of colonization, there was only an improvement in fortune for neo-European countries, and the other countries actually experienced no serious reversal of fortune because they were already poor. Before I begin to ask questions, just give us a brief summary of the paper, Elliott.
Sure, that's right. You basically got it correct. I mean, this is a paper by Asimoglu, Johnson, Robinson, published I think in 2001 or 2002, called "Reversal of Fortune," and they argued that basically countries that were colonized in Africa, Latin America, and Asia experienced a reversal of fortune, such that the countries which were sort of the richest countries in that region, the global south, as it were, the richest countries before colonization are now the poorest countries, and the poorest countries before colonization are now the richest countries. So there was a reversal. And so we basically looked at that paper, and it's a very influential and famous paper, and thought that we wanted to check some of the data. In particular, part of the problem, as you know, in studying history, especially outside Europe, is that we don't have a lot of good economic data on the history, the long history of many parts of the world. And so we have to use proxies in terms of how we understand how developed these areas were in the pre-colonial period. And two of the proxies we can think about is urbanization, in the sense that areas that were rich were able to support large numbers of people living in cities, and also generally population. Larger populations would indicate some larger level of wealth, at least in a sort of a Malthusian pre-modern period. So that was the way they measured it in the paper. And so we had a kind of closer look at the data in both cases, and found that we found some better data. At least we think that it's better data than the one that they used, and found basically the argument doesn't necessarily hold up when you use this different data. And that's why we called it reconsidered. It's sort of looking at the paper, rerunning some of their results, and finding that some of the results didn't hold up. In particular, I think the strongest result was that there was no real reversal within Africa, in the sense that African countries did not see a reversal, in the sense that the richest parts of Africa are not, before colonization, are not necessarily the poorest parts today, and vice versa. So that's the paper in a nutshell.
Elliot, I interviewed James Robinson recently, and we discussed his work on Botswana. For most of the interview, we discussed governance in Botswana, institutional quality, and future research. It was an interesting interview. I think the issue with that paper is that when you're comparing countries, you must explicitly state that we're referring to relative development. So on a relative level, countries in the Americas became poorer, but objectively today they're richer. I think that's the broader point. Objectively they're richer, but relatively they're poorer. And obviously the neo-European colonies of England were financed by people who were interested in trade and development. Secondly, many studies have shown that on average, British colonies do better, whereas the colonies in the Americas were sponsored by extractive individuals, and furthermore, they were resource rich. So maybe it led to the resource curse.
Yeah, my take on this is that I think there's a lot of things that are correct in that paper. I think in many cases, I think there are argument's correct. I think that the problem is that I think they're trying to make it across the whole world, and I think it applies in some parts of the world and not in others. You mentioned the Americas, and I think that I actually listened to your interview, your discussion with Jim Robinson, and I think if I recall correctly, he picked that up as well. That the argument perhaps holds best in the Americas, and I think that is possibly true. The areas that were rich in the pre-colonial period, like countries, well, today these are countries like Peru or Mexico, are definitely poorer than other parts of Latin America, say Argentina, and of course the US and Canada are richer, and they were poorer back then. So I think that the argument for the reversal makes more sense, I think, in the Americas. In Asia, it's more questionable. I think in Africa, it's even more questionable. So I think our point was basically that this might not mean necessarily a global phenomenon. It still is a phenomenon, but it might not apply across the entire world.
The late economist Louis Boudin wrote a book, and it is not properly remembered, and it is titled A Socialist Empire, the Incas of Peru. And I read that book. And the thesis of the book is that the Incas were basically extractive. So extraction is not new. Even before colonialism, states in that part of the world were already extractive. And this is also a significant issue that we should zero in on when we're explaining the matter of the deep roots of development. Extraction is not new. The Europeans did not introduce extractive institutions to the Americas. Extractive institutions already existed. The Europeans supplemented those extractive institutions with their institutions.
I think that's true. I mean, there's no question that there's huge variation in the quality of institutions across the pre-colonial world. I mean, the pre-colonial world is huge. I mean, it's vast amounts of the globe. So obviously there's huge amounts of variation. There are certain parts of that pre-colonial world which had quite inclusive institutions, right? You mentioned Botswana. We have this pre-colonial tradition of the khutbah, right? Sort of a council where people can actually speak and the chiefs will listen to people, and it was relatively inclusive. You have other areas, like you mentioned, the Inca, or maybe the Aztec or Mayan kingdoms or empires, which were highly exclusive. When I was talking about that, I remembered, I don't know if you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, Apocalypto, I think it's called, which is entirely filmed in Mayan, I think, and it was basically trying to portray the pre-colonial Mayan, if I recall correctly, I think the Mayan civilization. And again, extremely extractive and very bloody. Obviously, some of this is Hollywood, but a lot of it's actually based on true facts that we know about a lot of these pre-colonial kingdoms. So there's lots of variation, there's lots of extraction, and I think that's the interesting thing is to sort of suss out and try to examine where do we see inclusive institutions, where do we see extractive institutions, because I think that's really crucial to make that distinction.
And institutions are also impacted by the human capital that elites introduced to the colony. So I'm in favor of the argument postulated by Edward Glaser. He wrote some years ago that Europeans brought human capital and institutions with them to the New World. But in the analysis of the data, it is shown that human capital is a better predictor of growth than institutions. And this has been confirmed by separate research. Human capital measured in terms of IQ is a major predictor of governance quality and the levels of corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an ongoing debate. I think within economics and within economic history, there's certainly it's a massive debate. The human capital versus institutions debate. And in a lot of cases, again, I'll go back to Botswana. Right, Botswana had quite high levels of education, and that is possibly one of the reasons why it's done very well in the post-colonial period. You contrast that with other parts of Africa. Infamous example is the DRC. I've forgotten the number, but when they became independent from Belgium, the number of university graduates in the entire country, we could basically count on one hand, right? There's a remarkably uneducated country. And that clearly had a link with, had a consequence in terms of the post-colonial history of that country as well. So there's no question there's a strong link, I think, with bringing human capital and development. It's not to say that I'm going to come down one side or the other, but I think that that both matter. Obviously, the two are highly related as well. There's no questions that high quality institutions can lead towards high quality education, and vice versa.
Botswana and Congo are similar in the sense that on the eve of independence, they both had a paucity of superior graduates. Many countries in the Caribbean were actually better off in terms of education when compared to Botswana. But Botswana was given the edge because of leadership. It had a leader who was serious about facilitating commerce and long-term academic development. There's actually a paper, well, I'm paraphrasing, but the paper is titled "For Africa's First Leaders Do Matter." So the first leader of an African country can set the long-term trajectory. And on average, first leaders who are better educated and who care more about economics and not necessarily politics, they tend to create better countries. And the perfect example is Botswana. Botswana benefited from the first leader advantage.
Yeah, I have to say I completely agree with you. I think that this is Seretse Khama was the first president,
Yes.
as you know, of Botswana. Is really a remarkable man in many ways. I mean, many people will know him not necessarily from reading history, but from seeing. There was again a reference another Hollywood movie, The United Kingdom, I think it was called, which was discussion. I haven't seen it, unfortunately. Discussion of his interracial marriage. He married an Englishwoman, right? And of course, one of their children was Ian Khama, who was later the president of Botswana himself. But I think the crucial thing with Seretse Khama, and I think this is one thing that I think close students of Botswana history have really remarked upon is this idea that the diamond revenue, which has been so incredibly important for Botswanan development, that has never really been a major source of conflict, right? Again, going back to the comparison to the DRC, DRC has huge amounts of mineral resources, but there's been massive conflict over who actually controls those resources, whether it's the provinces or certain individuals or private individuals, public individuals. There's massive conflict over that. Botswana, what Khama did, which was so brilliant, was that he basically decided that the mineral resources would be governed by the state. They would be owned by the state and not controlled by individual territories. That's what happened in DRC. We had this attempt at secession from Katanga in southeast the DRC after independence, and that was partially linked up with the fact that they had lots of copper revenues. But Khama said basically, we have these diamonds, and we're going to have the state control it. It's not going to be controlled by individual territories. Nobody else can claim that. That's going to be controlled by the Botswana national government. And they've been able to use that for purposes of developing their country. And I think that's a crucial decision that he made. I do think, I think it's not just him. I think you're right to put a finger on this about sort of the first leaders that can really set a certain trajectory for a country. In certain cases where the leaders actually made correct decisions and set the country in the right trajectory. That's an example. Botswana is a good example of that. You can find that in other cases as well. I think in India, Nehru did something similar. But it's a general phenomenon, I think, and I think that's one thing that was picked up upon. I had a colleague at the LSE called Thandika Makandawere, a Malawian economist who wrote about that as well, exactly that point about the first leader advantage.
And furthermore, in Botswana, private entrepreneurs were allowed to invest in diamonds. So in other countries, the state monopolized resources, however, they would engage in rent-seeking activities by elevating their cronies. This was not done in Botswana. So when immigrants were fleeing from countries like Zimbabwe, they could experience a safe haven in Botswana.
That's true. And I think the other story to say, I think there's two key elements about Botswanan development in terms of the structure of the economy. One is diamonds, which is, vastly important. The other thing is that they have a strong history of ranching, right? The idea that you have many politicians then and now who have private interests in ranching. And that's one of the reasons why it's been a strong focus for the Botswanan state to make sure the currency doesn't get overvalued. The fact that happened in huge numbers of other parts of other African countries and elsewhere around the world, especially in the 70s and 80s. But Botswana was able to keep their currency stable. They kept pegging it to the South African rand, even under apartheid. And that was partially or very much driven by the fact that a lot of the politicians were ranchers, had private interests in making sure that they could export their hides and export beef from Botswana at competitive prices, and they were able to do that. That's how they actually maintained their currency not being overvalued. The other comparable case I think is interesting is Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, had some good level of success for 20 to 30 years or so, especially up until the 1980s, and that's very much linked up to the same story. The idea that a lot of the politicians in that country, including the president himself, had farming interests. They wanted to be able to export their crops, especially cocoa and coffee, and export them at competitive prices. And that's why they made sure that their currency was not too overvalued.
Key point. But back to your paper, we diverged a bit when we started to discuss Botswana. We're on the topic of the Americas. Elliott, I am interested in the long-term transmission of institutional quality. So for example, there's an area in economic research known as the deep roots of development, tracing modern success in Europe to cultural practices that were embedded in the medieval ages or even earlier, or we can go back to the pre-reform era. Do we are I am yet to see a study making this argument for the Americas. So for example, the Aztecs and the Mayans were relatively superior in the arena of technology, but I am wondering to what extent did these cultures transmit the institutions and knowledge capital?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not going to claim as much expertise on the
Yeah,
American.
because most people are not really studying this issue, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my understanding of the literature on institutions and technologies, again, the fact that you have, of course, the technological transmission over time, but it's also, of course, the creation of institutions that allow for new innovations and new inventions, right? And that's where, again, going back to people like Robinson and others who said that I think that institutions which promote innovation are really, really crucial, especially in the modern period, whereas institutions that stifle innovation are very dangerous, because then there's no incentive for people to actually create new technologies and new innovations. And that's something that, is true historically, but also true today, I think.
Yeah. So the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans, all of these civilizations collapsed due to various reasons. And maybe, well, we know the story of the Mayans already, but maybe if the Incans and the Aztecs were not affected by Europeans, they would have been wiped out either due to institutional decay or ecological crises. This is a these are facts that should be controlled for in research. And another fact is the counterfactual. In the absence of colonialism, would these countries be richer? That's an important point, because remember, they were extractive empires. Spain and Portugal were the original extractive empires in Europe, and today, relative to England and the Netherlands, they are laggards. So maybe if the Aztecs had maintained their hegemony, countries in the Americas would not have been as rich.
Yeah, it is an interesting question, and it's one that I talk to my students about sometimes. I think it's difficult / impossible, really, to answer that question. In the sense, because we have the history of colonization across the entire world, and the countries which are not colonized are the ones that were not. It's not like we can say, oh, they all would have looked like Ethiopia or Thailand or something. Or they're very rare examples of countries which weren't colonized, but they weren't colonized for a reason, right? And they weren't colonized because they had the ability to put up a strong fight or resist colonization. So it is possible. I do think there's, again, staying with this extractive story of extraction, I think there's no question that extractive institutions, whether then or now, are not good for development long term. So yeah, in that sense, if the Inca Empire had not been colonized, it continued to be extractive, it probably would have collapsed into civil war or anarchy at some point. That is possible, but it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, well, it's a hard question to answer, but not a difficult puzzle to solve. I am interested in several complicated issues, but I do believe that we have sufficient data on the topic published by people like Michael Smith and Francis Burden and others. So it's a testable hypothesis, and the answer may not be clear, but it's something we can invest in. In your piece, you refer to urbanization. The Aztecs had cities, but the Europeans created urban charters, cities that were autonomous, and this is a function of human capital and ideas. So again, Europeans had certain advantages that were not discovered in other places until centuries later.
Yeah, I think so. Again, the history of urbanization is itself a fascinating topic, and I think that one of the things that you find in pre-modern societies, whether it's in South America or even in Europe or Africa, is you get sometimes the rise of great cities, like you find in parts of the Inca or Aztec empires and the Mayan empires. But then those cities will ebb and flow in size. They will grow when the state is growing, in the sense the state can provide enough surplus for people to live in those cities. But then when the surplus disappears, people no longer live in the cities and they flee back to the countryside for the simple reason they can't afford to buy any food. There's no food to buy. And that's when they need to go back to the countryside to grow their own food. But of course, the crucial thing is when you get self-perpetuating cities, especially into the modern period, that are able to produce enough wealth in those cities that they'll be able to buy enough food no matter what's happening around them. So that's something that develops only really, I think, in the 19th century. Even in Europe, up until the 18th century, you start seeing, some ebbing and flowing. Although that, the 18th century is when you start reaching high levels of urbanization in countries like the Netherlands or England. But I think that's one thing that you find in the pre-modern period, that there's this huge flux in terms of the ability of people to stay in cities over a long term.
And then we should consider the issue of knowledge spillovers. So by a certain period, knowledge spillovers were more evident in European cities. But what do we know about pre-industrial knowledge spillovers? And this is a before you answer the question, this is an issue I have with the literature on colonialism. It is positing the argument mostly that some countries are poor because of colonialism, but researchers are failing to account for several variables. The case of pre-industrial knowledge spillovers is also important. If it is shown that knowledge spillovers were more evident in the pre-industrial economy of Europe, then the Great Divergence started earlier than we originally assumed. And there are many areas of the Great Divergence. We should be talking about the divergences, not the Great Divergence. There were several.
Yeah, so I certainly think. I mean, there was trade. I mean, there certainly was a fair amount of trade in parts of pre-colonial Africa, and there was some, development of trade networks that actually traded, technologies as well. That goes back to the sort of argument you get from people like Jared Diamond, right? The idea that the issue what happened in Eurasia was that there was you could trade across the same latitude at very, very long distances from Western Europe all the way to Eastern Asia. Whereas in countries like South America, or particularly in Africa, the north-south nature of the continent mean that technologies didn't travel very far because they were developed at a certain latitude, especially in terms of farming technologies. But they tried to take that technology farther north or farther south, and it didn't work very well. So that kind of inhibited the sort of geography of those areas, inhibited the trading networks that could have developed. And that's one thing that Eurasia, not just Europe, but Asia as well, allowed for that very large scale trade across the same latitudes. I find that argument moderately persuasive. I think there's a lot.
Jared's arguments are not implausible. It's just that he fails to account for cultural factors and G as a measure of ability. That's the problem with Jared Diamond. So for example, I'm happy you referred to Africa. Africans at markets, you can read Ayiti and Morton Jervin. The issue is that, like so many places in the non-Western world, Africa failed to develop widespread impersonal trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. I mean, you can, and again, I know you know this about Joe Henricks and
yes,
which I just finished reading recently, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. In terms of the development of weird ideas in industrialized societies, and the fact that people who live in more communal or non-weird environments, according to Henricks, I think that makes a lot of sense. Whether it's Africa or Asia or Latin America. But again, it's still something that the book just came out. I think there's still a lot of discussion about how that theory can fit into broader theories about institutions and trade and human capital, as you said. There's a lot of questions about what's causing what. But I do think there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, individualism is a robust. Well, individualism is actually the most robust cultural predictor of economic performance. I had Gerard Rowland on the show recently. Individualism predicts innovation, institutional quality, and even the rate of venture capital success. And these are all fairly recent studies. And the non-Western world is less individualistic than the Western world. And this is a topic that I will always be labor, because the issue keeps expanding, and the literatures are numerous. So individualism has an inherent advantage, especially for a capitalist economy.
Yeah, but again, of course, I think the individualism is important, but only given the institutions which allow that to thrive, right? So the one thing is the attitudes of people about whether they the way that the psychological attitudes that Henricks picks up in his surveys that he cites in that book. That's, of course, one part of the story. The other part of the story is that, even if you're individualist, but you don't live in the society which values individualism or in institutions which allow you to develop those and earn money from those traits, then that's not going to make any difference, right? And I think that's, again, where people like Robinson have come in, that, you might have all these great innovators, great inventors, but the institutions are stifling their innovations and not creating any incentives for them to do that, then they're not going to bother with them, right? And that's something that I think so it's a mixture of the attitudes themselves, but also the institutions that allow for development in a broad sense.
Yeah, institutional interaction than gene culture coevolution the Cambridge Journal of Institutional Economics has been furnishing us with a panoply of papers arguing that free market economies do better in individualistic cultures. So this is one reason why the free market revolution has not been quite successful in some developing countries. I actually wrote an article on the topic some years ago, not years ago, recently.
Okay. I'd like to have a look at that.
Yeah. It's titled Trust Corruption. I'll send you the email. But economic freedom sounds appealing, but it's also based on culture. In some cultures, there's a greater respect for economic freedom and the role of the entrepreneur in generating development. But these issues are hard to measure because some people are not as individualistic as the West, but they have done well, like the Igbos. The Igbos are more individualistic than other groups in Africa, but not as individualistic as the West. I refer to Igbo individualism as communal individualism. They believe in the value of the person to create his own wealth, but they also respect the community.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. It reminds me, by the way, I don't know if you come across the work of Gregory Clark, economic historian.
I interviewed him some time ago.
Oh, okay, because one of the points he makes in his book about immigrants to the U.S. is the most successful immigrant group in the entire United States is Nigerian Americans, and I think many of them are Igbo. But again, it's coming from a tradition, if you might, talk about a culture of entrepreneurship, and I think that it explains some of their success. But obviously you're right. I think there's going to be a lot of variation within Africa. There's going to be a variation even within Nigeria across a lot of these traits. Again, I think Henrik's book is fascinating. I still have to think about how we integrate that into a broader discussion of development because, like I said, I think a lot of these traits, he likes to think of them as being caused by institutions like the Catholic Church or something like that. But I think a lot of these traits can be endogenous, right? The sense that institutions and states can promote certain cultures, certain ideas and attitudes of individualism, and those can filter through society, or they can be inculcated, or they could be destroyed, depending on the state that you live in. So, but I mean, he argues for a more, sort of exogenous understanding of those traits as something that comes down over time. I'm a bit agnostic about it, but I think it's something that we have to think more about.
Well, I've read Gregory Clark, but more recent data, maybe from around 2019 or 2020, these studies argue that Indian Americans are the richest immigrant group, but the Nigerians have done exceptionally well, especially the Igbos. They tend to work in academia, and if they're in finance, they're not entrepreneurs. And again, African immigrants are educated, but one writer contends that social capital in Africa is lower, but this point is debatable. There are those who disagree by asserting that associational life in Africa is actually productive, but for the most part, the consensus is that social capital in Africa is lower. So due to these issues, when African immigrants migrate to America, they tend to work for American companies instead of starting African companies built by their fellow Africans, whereas Caribbean people are inclined to be entrepreneurs. Social capital in the Caribbean is also low, but not as low. And there's the SUSU system and the partner system in countries like Jamaica. So when immigrants, well, especially in the past, when they migrated to the US, they invested in SUSU and partner and they started businesses. So Caribbean immigrants tend to be a bit more entrepreneurial than African immigrants, even though African immigrants are highly educated.
Yeah, so I didn't know that. And of course, there's also the example of the Senegalese immigrants, right, who emigrate to the U.S. and elsewhere, and they have very strong trading networks, and that leads towards a different sort of level of wealth that they generate. They also tend to be very successful, no matter where they are, I think.
But I'm happy that you refer to Eurasia. So the earliest states were formed in that part of the world. They were not European states, but somewhere along the line there was a great divergence in income. Europe got a jump start, and those countries were left behind, like Egypt and Syria. Now, many in the academic community submit that early statehood is a predictor of economic stagnation, because over a period of time the state becomes extractive, and it is basically an ossified state, whereas intermediate states tend to be better. This argument is partially convincing, and I say partially convincing because I am more interested in the long-term roots of intelligence and the cognitive revolution that first occurred in the West. I think this is an issue that we must answer. China, the proto-enlightenment movement, and it fizzled out because of personality issues. But intelligence is exceptionally important, and we must incorporate more of intelligence in research. For whatever reason, the cognitive revolution occurred in the West, and there is a growing field linking the cognitive revolution to the Neolithic revolution and the Ice Age. The studies are still early, so I'm not going to comment. But this is an interesting era of research. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'll go back to what you said about the history of statehood, because I think that's quite interesting. I mean,
Yes.
on the one hand, you have the argument that you mentioned that states can be very stifling. Like a history of statehood can be bad, right? The states, and that again goes back to the Asimov-Robinson theories that you have states which stifle innovation. However, on the other hand, we have a literature, I think Louis Putterman and others have written about this, that the longer the state exists, the more it's able to sort of control territory and create order. And the longest continually existing state in the world is China, and there's a reason why China's been doing very well recently. It's because it has a sense of coherence and order that other parts of Asia don't necessarily have. But we can go to Africa and the same story. What's one of the countries in Africa which has had the greatest amount of economic success in the last 20 years, and that's Rwanda. Rwanda is also a state which goes back to the pre-colonial period. It's not extremely old in the way that China is, but by African standards, it's very old. And so you have this history of institutions. I'm not calling them democratic at all. It's not a democratic state, but it has this history of institutions which are coherent and considered legitimate, I think, by most people within Rwanda. And that's why the state obviously went through this massive tumultuous period of the genocide and civil war in the 1990s. But since then has been really doing extremely well. And I think that's not an accident that you have this history of statehood in Rwanda, which is able to promote some level of growth. The same sort of thing applies in Ethiopia as well. Again, pre-colonial state, again, by no means democratic, but it has been relatively successful relative to other parts, even other parts of the Horn, relative to parts of Somalia or Sudan in the last couple of decades. And I think the history of statehood can go both ways. You can have a negative effect. The negative effect, by the way, reminds me of Mansur Olson, his book, The Rise and Decline of Nations. He wrote about that, the idea that you have the stifling amount of institutions which will stifle innovation over time. But the statehood can also be positive in the sense that it can create order and create incentives for people to work together and not fight each other.
But why are some transmission mechanisms more efficient than others? So I was actually planning to mention Ethiopia, where our minds are meeting. Ethiopia is a compelling story. As a student, I was introduced to the Aksumite Empire, and I'm interested in medieval Ethiopia and Ethiopian imperialism. I said recently to myself, because I like to think a lot and sometimes aloud, Ethiopia is a fragile state, but not a failed state, and will not fail. I doubt that Ethiopia will fail because due to its history of statehood, it has developed managerial competence. But Ethiopia is not rich. It is not innovative. Even when compared to China, Ethiopia has not done well. So I'm wondering, why are some states better positioned to transmit institutional knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, but the interesting thing as well about Ethiopia, which is people often say it wasn't colonized, which is technically true. but its borders expanded immensely compared to as a result of sort of bargaining with European powers. So it wasn't directly colonized, but the colonization had a massive effect on Ethiopia by making it the borders much larger and basically making the Solomonic dynasty control huge amounts of people that had never controlled before, to the peripheral territories, and that meant that I think at one point it was called the prison house of nations. It was basically, became this incredibly difficult country to manage, and that's exactly effectively what happened. In the end, they had this conflict that led towards the secession of Eritrea, and it also meant that even today, that they have this ethnic federal model that's existed for almost 30 years now, but it's difficult to manage, and I think that's one of the big problems. If Ethiopia had gone back to the borders it had sort of the mid-19th century, I think it'd be a much more manageable state. It's actually it's a huge population, over 100 million people. And even with their attempts to sort of manage it with this ethnic federal model, I'm not sure it's been extremely successful. It's been successful in the sense of promoting growth, but I'm not sure in the long term whether it's going to continue to be successful. I've seen in the recent conflict there.
A variation between Ethiopia and China is the quality of bureaucracy and the non-religious works. The Ethiopian state is nominally religious, and I use the word nominally because no serious political leader is an actual religious ideologue. They use religion to legitimate power and authority. The Chinese state had a bureaucracy and education system. We can always debate the extent to which this education system promoted innovation, but China had an education system, bureaucracy, and the Song dynasty was innovative, even though the innovations petered out. Whereas in Ethiopia, the intellectuals were mostly religious scholars. So because China has a longer history of civilizational complexity, the Chinese, they're better able to appropriate modern and the foreign technologies. Whereas for Ethiopia, scalability is lower because of its history of religion and the lower level of civilizational complexity.
Yeah, I mean, the religion aspect is really important. I mean, I think that's one of the things that made it very distinct within Africa was this history of indigenous Christianity, not Christianity that was imposed on them by colonial powers. Of course, again, like I said, part of the issue in Ethiopia today is not just the sort of ethnic diversity that's a result of the late 19th, early 20th century, but also religious diversity, right? You have a huge Muslim population, and you have that big conflict ethnically and religiously about, what should the state consist of? Under Emperor Haile Selassie, who ruled from, the 30s through the 70s, his vision of Ethiopia was extremely homogenous, right? All Ethiopians would learn to speak and read and write Amharic, and they would all be Orthodox Christians, right? So that was effectively, that's what led to the state breaking up and leading to civil war and eventually the secession of Eritrea. And they've gone to the opposite extreme now by becoming this sort of having this ethnic federalist model. But that's been an ongoing tension. I think under his model, Ethiopia, he wanted to make Ethiopia look like France, sort of homogenizing linguistically and also religiously, and that was not successful. And I think that could never be successful in a country like Ethiopia. Again, China, that's linguistically diverse and also religiously diverse, but again, because it's not sort of an overarching religion like Christianity, it hasn't sort of tried to impose the religion on people the way that they have under Ethiopian rulers. So there is comparisons to be made there, I think, but it's again slightly different.
Yeah, and Elliott, please remember that the Chinese government is quite efficacious in containing dissent. And this is independent, irrespective of the time period. The Chinese government, when forced to clamp down on dissent, is quite successful. This is something that we must contend with. So even though some argue that China is becoming innovative and is also investing in R&D, China is a rule by law state, not a rule of law state. And will always be a rule by law state. Legalism succeeded in China, not the proto-liberal philosophies of people like Mencius.
Right.
And in Ethiopia, the nature of Christianity is crucial. The medieval Europeans at scholasticism, they engage in all sorts of weird debates about the nature and origin of God, but essentially it was a self-critical philosophy, whereas the Ethiopians, their Christianity is closer to the Christianity of the Byzantine Empire. It is more theoretical and less self-critical. So a Protestant Reformation could not have occurred in Ethiopia.
Yeah, I mean, again, you probably know that there's this long literature now as well linking Protestantism to literacy and also to democracy in
Yes.
the world. And I think that's something that, that's actually quite interesting. The idea of Protestant missionaries who've been, not necessarily with the goal of spreading democracy, but the sort of indirect effects of creating more literate societies. And that's something that, again, you see historically in Ethiopia and other parts of the world where you have sort of a religion that's not necessarily focused on promoting literacy. That's, again, the Catholic Church as well, historically up until the 1960s was focused on teaching Latin, right? So that meant that people weren't necessarily learning how to read and write, and that didn't lead towards more democratic institutions. So that's something that, Ethiopia suffered from, but also other countries in Africa suffered from who had more Catholic missionaries and Protestant missionaries.
The Catholic missionaries may be more conservative than Protestant missionaries, but some argue that when we really compare the medieval scholastics to Protestants, they were actually quite rational. The medieval church built the university and the legal system of the West. So, in a sense, I am pro-Catholic. I think the issue is that Protestantism is individualistic. So because Protestantism is individualistic, innate in Protestantism is autonomy. So autonomy is embedded in this worldview. So when I read the studies, I get the impression that the writers implicitly are saying that individualism is the channel through which the benefits of Protestantism can be realized. So instead of going to church, you teach yourself how to read and you interpret the Bible for yourself. This encourages individualism and democracy. So it's an indirect effect.
Yeah, and again, you can apply that elsewhere. I think that you can say the same thing about Judaism, right? Judaism, again, focused on individuals reading the Bible. Any kind of religion.
The Torah, yes.
It doesn't have to be a religion. It could be any kind of culture which promotes, and religion is very effective because, again, historically people have been very religious, and so they adhere to the rules and institutions of their religion. But any kind of culture which promotes a strong sense of literacy is going to have, leads towards more individualism and also leads towards more economic growth, especially in the modern period, right? And I think that's that in some sense that's the Marx favor sort of argument in a nutshell.
Yeah, but in your paper, you also refer to African. We have been talking about Latin, the Americas for a while, so let's discuss Africa. What did you find for Africa?
Sorry, which paper? I forgot.
The reconsidering reconsidering the reversal of fortune. Yes, we went off on a tangent.
Yeah. So I mean, again, that's the main finding of that paper is that we don't see we don't see reversal. And again, I mentioned which paper because I think you mentioned a couple other papers in your email, and one of them was another paper we found. We looked at Uganda.
Yeah, but we're going to discuss that soon. But Africa, Elliott, Africa has been poor for a long time.
The two papers are on the same line, which is that we see that persistence. Right? We see a story of persistence over time. The idea that parts of Africa, which were relatively poor in the relative to each other in the pre-colonial period, are still relatively poor today, again, relative to other parts of Africa. So we see that persistence over time. We don't see that reversal taking place within Africa.
Yeah.
That says, and again, we can talk about the history of colonialism. And the well-known fact of African colonialism was that it was very short. Right? It was very expensive, but also very, very short. So the idea that these societies were immensely affected in all sorts of ways by colonial rule. But I also think that there was in terms of the nature of who held wealth and the sort of nature of wealth, not just within countries but across countries, I think was perhaps less affected than the AJR papers makes it out to be. Again, it goes back to Gregory Clark. Gregory Clark's work has shown. He has this book, you probably talked about it with him, about the sun also rises, about using last names to track wealth, intergenerational transmission of wealth. And he looked at in that book, I think he had a chapter on China and showed that the people whose last names, the people with those last names were rich before the Chinese Revolution under the imperial China are still relatively rich today. So you have this history, a century of revolt and revolution, communism, and you still see that persistence over time. And I think that's one of the crucial things you learn from studying economic history was that there's an incredible amount of persistence, no matter what kind of institutions are in place in societies which see all sorts of disruption. There's still persistence over time, and that applies to Africa.
Yeah, and Elliott, the enduring persistence of elite families has been replicated for Asia and Europe. Even in Asia, the same families have been wealthy for several generations.
Yeah.
Is it the same for Africa? I want to see a study on that topic.
I do too. I read that book and I thought I have an idea. Maybe I'll still do it at some point. Is to do something about that with Uganda. There's certainly ways to trace names over time, at least into back to the early colonial period, possibly the pre-colonial period.
You should do it for the Asante Empire because the Asante Empire practiced assortative mating in the pre-colonial era. So you should do it for the Asante Empire. But I would love to see someone with your intellect produce a study like that for Africa. But yeah. Elliott, Africa has been lagging behind for centuries. During the Common Era, North Africa was on par with Western Europe. Then there was a divergence, and since then, Africa has been a laggard. Some ascribe the economic sluggishness in Africa to geography, and I hold to this view. I even wrote an article on the topic. Landlocked countries don't do well, but Botswana is the exception. There's also the case of malaria and the tsetse fly and many other negative geographical and factor endowments. Are we underestimating the role of geography in shaping Africa's future? I know Jeffrey Sachs is big on the topic, but many seem to disagree with him. I get the impression that we are underestimating geography.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think that into the future. I mean, certainly, I think in the past you would say that the geography played an absolutely crucial role. There's no question. I think again the institution stories we've already talked about, the geography, the effects of malaria, for instance, in terms of explaining underdevelopment. I think that's absolutely crucial in understanding African underdevelopment historically. Is the effects of things like the tsetse fly or malaria or other sort of geographic factors that lead to high levels of disease. The slave trade is
Nathan Nunn did that study.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, the slave trade is also linked up with geography. The famous paper by Nunn, but also he has another second paper where he talks about the effect of the slave trade was to drive Africans up into the mountains, away from the coast and into unproductive environments, right? To make them run away from slave traders, which means they survived, but they also ran away from areas where they could be more economically productive. So there's a long-term link between history and geography. I mean, into the future, well, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things to say about the future of how the geography might affect African development is mineral resources in terms of oil and diamonds. We talk about gold. Botswana, of course, has benefited a lot from diamonds. We have, as we possibly might see in the future, sort of increasing scarcity around petroleum resources as they decline in places like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. You might see an increase in interest, and you are seeing an increase in interest in African oil reserves. And you see a lot of countries developing the oil reserves and possibly be able to use them for good purposes, unlike in the past where a lot of the times that led to higher levels of corruption and conflict. So if African countries can manage their natural resources well, and I think that there's Botswana sets an example of a country which can do that. I think Ghana is doing relatively well with that today. Other countries in Africa have started to do a better job at managing their natural resources. Then there's a lot of potential there. I mean, the country with the biggest potential of all, of course, is the DRC for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of minerals that they have there, including the vast amount of water power that they have along the Congo River. If that's managed correctly, it could produce a huge amount of a huge economic bonus for the country. If you think 50 years from now, who do we predict in Africa is going to be doing much better than today? The DRC maybe is one country that could be. I mean, they certainly couldn't be doing much worse, to put it that way. But I think there's a lot of potential for countries like the DRC to generate a lot of positive economic growth from natural resources.
But Nathan Nunn admits that Without the slave trade, Africa would be richer, but still not as rich as Europe. And the slave trade also positively selected for mistrust. Because of the slave trade, people became more skeptical of their peers. So it's selected for mistrust. And I do agree with the data. But Africa is a complicated, weird, and just romantic place all at the same time. At the present moment, I'm interested in diversity and its ability to hamper progress in Africa, and also the role of culture, institutions, and intelligence. So, for example, long-term evolutionary selections can promote a preference for delayed gratification versus immediate gratification. I think this is another era for fruitful research, looking at the link between delayed gratification and long-term progress. There's an academic who has produced some papers on the topic, and he's based somewhere in Polynesia. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he has done some interesting research. I think this is something to be considered.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd be interested to see that.
Yeah, delayed gratification. I know it impacts development and also patience. Though Menani's co-authors, they have a paper on patience. They call it Patience and the Wealth of Nations.
Yeah. I mean, again, going back to the trust issue, I mean, this is, again, another one of Nathan Nunn's papers is the one you just referenced, is the one with Leonard Wanchicon, right, about mistrust and the slave trade. The effect of slave trade on the growth is via trust. And so this is, again, this idea that you have this is a good example of where you have sort of cultural attributes like trust, which on the one hand you would say, of course, they have a big impact on development, which is true, but then that they themselves are product of something else, right? So that you could say that, this is where we have the story about Henrik's, the idea of the weird being weird or non-weird. And I think trustworthy is one of the things he does. I think he talks about that in the book.
Yes.
And, again, that we have, on the one hand, we can say it's going to have an effect on growth long term. But on the other hand, we could say that attribute, those cultural attributes that are pro-growth, they themselves are caused by something else. So if we can kind of go to the deep origins of what causes these attributes, then we can talk about how we can change them. The one thing I'm staying on that book because I just finished reading it a couple of weeks ago. But the one thing I found frustrating is it's a very long book, but
It's not that long. It's over 400 pages. That's not that long.
Yeah, a lot of footnotes. But I mean, the issue is I was hoping for a chapter at the end is like, how do we get societies to become more weird? The one thing he talked about was how South Korea and China, have changed their marriage patterns in terms of promoting promoting more monogamous marriage and changing patterns of marriage to make them more weird looking. But I mean, that's something that I thought he could have discussed a bit more. And that's, again, the idea that we have these cultural attributes. The same thing can go for talking about trust in Africa. How do we get towards higher levels of trust to combat this historical legacy of the slave trade? That's something that I don't know. I don't think that Nani and Wanchicon talked about in their paper. It's something that I'd like to hear them and other people, think more actively about. Is how we get over this. It is true. I mean, it's not just them. It's other people have shown this too. That there's low levels of trust, interpersonal trust, in these kind of countries, in large chunks of Africa and the developing world. And it's not conducive for growth. And it's something that we have to find a way to deal with. But I'm not sure what the answer is.
Elliot, I was once an advocate of westernization because Western societies are richer. But then one day, when I say one day, I'm literally referring to like a few days ago, I sat down and I said, some countries love their culture. Yes, Western countries may appear to be more progressive, but let's say for argument's sake that people in India or Nigeria love Nigerian culture and they don't want to be as rich as the West. Maybe the West should remain weird and other countries should remain non-weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing is that you see, and again, that comes up in the book, right, is that you see this within these countries. You see, university students and more intellectuals or higher income individuals, especially, there's this quite strong disconnect, I think, between those people who are kind of trying to break out of the system or feel uncomfortable within this sort of non-weird culture, if you want to put it that way, and then people who might have more weird influences. And so I think there's a lot of a lot of internal struggle within countries like that, large chunks of the developing world where you see that. And I think it's
Eh,
going to.
Elliot, I'm a man of science and data, and the science is now partially clear. I'm saying partially clear because science is never settled, but studies are showing that intellectual autonomy and individualism are major predictors of innovation and human capital formation. So I live in a country that's closer to collectivism on the spectrum. According to research, Jamaican culture is embedded, but I'm an eccentric figure. For a long time, I wrote articles, and the editor, I told him that I was black, and he still assumed that I was white. So my outlook is very different from people in Jamaica, and they've accepted the fact that Jamaica will never become a weird country. Yes, I waste no time giving suggestions. I don't write for their newspapers anymore. I've just moved on. Some countries don't want to be weird, and let them be non-weird at their own peril or advantage.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. Look, and I think this is something again Hendrik says. I think a lot of people we've discussed today would say as well that there are multiple ways to become rich, right? It's not like we would like to say that these are certain traits. If you adopt these sort of traits or attitudes or ideas, then it'll create a more pro growth environment. Of course, there are other ways to become rich. That I mean, Botswana. I haven't seen the surveys for Botswana. I would imagine that Botswanan surveys would show most people being non-weird. I would entirely imagine that. And again, having done field work there, I think that makes complete sense. Botswana has done extremely well economically. It's an upper middle income country. And yet, you still see parts of Botswana which feel very typical of other parts of Africa and a much lower, they look like much lower level income environments.
Right.
But because you have the natural resources, because you have good management of the natural resources, the economy's been able to grow, and you're able to generate a lot of growth and reduce poverty and increase well-being. And I think that's true in other environments as well. Like if you're able to, you can have societies which the attitudes can be more typical to low-income countries, but the societies themselves are relatively rich because of all sorts of other factors.
Because they have found a way to maximize their factor endowment, and that requires intelligence. I take intelligence seriously. I don't believe we should discredit the role of intelligence, and I have my reasons for taking intelligence seriously. But I want you now to briefly comment on your paper on Uganda, the relationship between pre-colonial institutions and the provision of public goods. You said that you found a stronger relationship between I read your paper in its entirety. You said you found a stronger relationship between the provision of private goods and pre-colonial institutions. All right, briefly comment on it.
Okay, so the brief story is that we have a literature which this contributes towards looking at, again, the history of statehood. We have the idea that we have countries which have a history of statehood, or at least hierarchical institutions, as defined by sort of a bunch of anthropologists writing in the mid-20th century. We have this idea that those people who come from ethnic groups or countries which have a higher level, a higher level of sort of hierarchy in the way they organize themselves. Those states are richer today, or at least they have better outcomes in a variety of measures. And so that previous literature was kind of focused on a cross-national basis. And we thought, let's take a look at this on an individual country basis, because in Uganda, like other parts of Africa, actually, there's huge variation within the country as well. So you have northern Uganda, and historically, the people who lived in northern Uganda tended to live in a much less hierarchical environment, more of the sort of village-level chiefs and nothing above that. Whereas in the south, we have this history of kingdoms, some of them very powerful and many of them very old. They go back centuries. Again, very similar to Rwanda, which of course borders Uganda in the southwest. That the whole area of the Great Lakes region is well known for having a lot of kingdoms. Burundi as well. And so we said, okay, we found this evidence. That's fine. We find that people are richer, they're less poor. There's high levels of GDP, perhaps, in these areas. But they don't seem to have better public goods provision. There's more literacy, but I think the literacy is tied up with the fact that this is very true in the developing world, that you have to have private tutors, you go to private school, and that's why people do better in terms of literacy. But in terms of public health outcomes like immunization or basic measures of public services, we don't find that those areas that have this history of hierarchical government are doing any better than other parts of the country. So for us, I think what seems to make sense is that these are again, the persistent story, which I mentioned, the idea that we have areas that were relatively rich in the 19th century, that are still relatively rich today. And I think that persistence over time in terms of how people have been able to manage their wealth and keep their wealth rather than lose it. And that for us, I think, is the crucial story, that it's about persistence of private wealth over time, and it's not about the quality of public institutions.
All right. So I enjoyed our interview. We're wrapping up now. You wrote a paper on ethnic marriage in sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's interesting. I won't talk about it, but I believe that there's a relationship between exogamy and individualism and intelligence. So we'll talk about your paper at another time. But Elliott, recently, just say I'm a big fan of your research and the research of other people. And it has always been my dream to finance research. And recently, quite fortuitously, I got some money. And I said, okay, it's not a lot of money, but maybe I could give out some partial grants, maybe $1,000 or 500 or $2,000. And that's what I intend to do. I intend to give partial grants to fund research. So during an email, we'll talk about this more deeply.
Sure, absolutely.
But yeah, so I'm planning to start a new Baconian revolution in the West.
Good.
Yes, all right.
Excellent. Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it is. So it was a pleasure to speak to you, and I'm serious about the Baconian revolution. All right, then, bye.
Thank you, Lipton. It was a good conversation.
All right.